How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Aleph, Daf 51 of masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends. Yo, friends, today is going to be an awesome daf. Wow, I have a feeling it's going to be a long daf too, but a very awesome daf. A very awesome daf. We're going to be talking about offerings to Avodah Zarah. We've learned recently, I think at least once. Did we have it? Where was it? We had it yesterday. Where else did we have it? Okay. Oh, it says the common different base. Okay, but I thought we also had it earlier. Anyways, that it says Vayitzomdu levalpor vayochlu zivchei mesim, I think was the pasuk. Now we basically compare offerings of Avodah Zarah to mesim, and just like mesim, their tumah never goes away. So also the isser of an offering of Avodah Zarah never goes away, cannot become batel. So we are going to define what is considered an offering to Avodah Zarah that never becomes batel. It is an interesting discussion there. And after that, we will get to animals that have mums. What happens if one sacrifices for Avodah Zarah an animal that has a mum, a blemish? We will then move on to making sacrifices to Avodah Zarah, like sacrificing animals, and decorating, right, things that are decorations for Avodah Zarah, and finally a sugya. Interestingly, a lot of these things have kind of been coming up, but like here, we're really going to jump into it. And then, finally, as came up a few days ago, with like a bathhouse that is in the chotzer of Avodah Zarah, or a garden, things like that. Can you get benefit from those kinds of things? So it's pretty interesting sugyas, I would say, related to Avodah Zarah. So without further ado, we are going to jump in. We will be starting on Daf Nun Amud Beis, about 5 or 10 lines or so from the bottom on Daf Nun Amud Beis. So I would say, even before we actually read the Gemara, let us actually have a quick look at a Rashi there on the side of the Gemara. It's a bit of a long Rashi. We're not going to read the whole thing. But in the Rashi, Dibra Amaschil, Shiber Makul B'fonei Achayev, okay, a little bit to the right and slightly above where we are in the Gemara. Kedaminon, Beper Dalet Mi-Assistant Sanhedrin, D'chol Avodos Shebifnim She'ovad Bein Avodos Kochavim, Ben Darke B'chach u'Ben She'ein Darke B'chach Chayev. Chaver. So that's going to be really important right now for the first part of today's daf. I'm going to read that again and translate. D'chol avodah shebifnim, that any service that was done in the Beis HaMikdash, when it comes to korbanis, if you do that with Avodah Zarah, she'avad ben Avodah Zarah, use that service, that activity for Avodah Zarah, ben darke b'chach, ben shein darke b'chach, whether this is the way that the Avodah Zarah is meant to be worshipped or not, chayav, you will be chayav for that. So let's say you take markulis or something as an example, that there's, you're supposed to, how do you serve markulis? You take rocks and you throw it at the pile of rocks. Amazing. That's markulis. However, if you do zvicha, okay, we'd have to define what is zvicha for markulis. What could that possibly look like? Or zrika. Interestingly, we're actually going to talk about that a little bit later, because you're supposed to throw things at markulis. So is that zrika? Throwing? How do we explain throwing? So anyways, that is, okay, I think that's it. I'll also just say one more thing, okay? So that was thing number one, that when it comes to Avodah Zarah, even if there's a specific way that you serve it, and this is different. Of course, there are global things that are chayav, they be chayav for Avodah Zarah. For example, right, zvicha, kitur, nisuch, hishtachavoya. Those, of course, are global Avodah Zarah things. If you slaughter an animal, as we're going to learn about at the bottom of that Nun Aleph Amud Aleph. If you slaughter an animal for Avodah Zarah, you can be chayav for zvicha, slaughtering an animal, right? Or if you burn, I guess, stuff for Avodah Zarah, or bow down to Avodah Zarah. Those are kind of like global stuff that you'd be chayav for when it comes to Avodah Zarah. Here, we're talking about something else, which is doing an activity for Avodah Zarah that is similar to an activity that was done in the Beis HaMikdash. You know what? I think we'll actually leave it there for now. I think that that's enough for us to get started. There's going to be another important distinction. I don't think that we need to get into it yet. I think let's first get our feet wet, and we'll get to the other distinction when we get there soon. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. So it says Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, about 5-10 lines from the bottom of Nun Amid Beis. Okay, so here we go. So this is important. So if you have some kind of Avodah Zarah, we're not talking about anything specific right now that I know of. We're not talking about Markulis, Por, or whatever. Some kind of Avodah Zarah, we'll call it stickler. The Avodah Zarah is called stickler. Sticko. That's way better. About 10 times better. Sticko. So if you have any suggestions for one that's 100 times better, let me know. Sticko. And the way that you serve sticko is with a stick. You tap the stick. You tap it just a few times, not too many, just a few times. There's Avodah Zarah called sticko, and the way that you worship sticko, you take a stick, you tap it just a few times, perfect. Now sticko does whatever you want. Life is good now. So Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, so if you have Avodah Zarah that you worship with a stick, Shiber makol bifonel. So if you break a stick in front of it, chayiv. You're chayiv for that. Zarak makol bifonel potter. If you throw a stick before it, you are potter. Let's go weiter. Amar le'abai, it says Abaye le'rove. Maishna shiber davle ke'in zvicha. Zarak nami havle ke'in zrika. Amar le'ba'ina zrika mishtaber zvileka. Wow. There was so much there. There was so much there. What were all the things that were there? A lot. So as I said, any kind of avodah that you do that is similar to something that was done inside of the Beis HaMikdash, you're going to be chayiv for. So we had said you have this Avodah Zarah called sticko, and you serve it with a stick. How do you serve it with a stick? Well, you tap it a few times, and that's how you serve it with the stick. But what you did was you broke the stick in half. That's what you did. You didn't tap the stick. You broke the stick in half. Now, the thing is, so breaking a stick in half is not the way that you serve sticko. You tap it a few times. But breaking something in half, you could argue is similar to zvicha. Zvicha, you like cut an animal in half. You cut its head off. You slit its throat. You slaughter the animal. And here you're slaughtering a stick, so to speak. So you'd be chayiv for that. However, we say that if you throw this stick at sticko, you'd be potter, to which Abaye asks, wait, but shouldn't that be considered like zrika? In the Beis HaMikdash, we do zrika sadam. Shouldn't that be zrika? So we say no, because part of how we define zrika is that when you throw blood and you throw it on the mizbeach, it splatters in different directions. Throwing a stick, it's a solid, and it's not going to break into smaller pieces, into different directions or whatever. So it's not a proper comparison to zrika. It wouldn't fall under the definition of zrika, so that isn't zrika, and you'd be potter for that because it's not the way that it's served. The way that you serve sticko is by tapping the stick a few times. If you tap the stick a few times, so you're chayiv. If you throw the stick, you're potter. Throwing is similar to inside in the Beis HaMikdash. It's not really similar to the Beis HaMikdash. In the Beis HaMikdash, when you throw it, it splatters all over the place. Here, it's a stick. It's not splattered. However, if you break the stick in half, we can argue that that is similar to zvicha, and therefore you'd be chayiv for that. Now, it's important to point out that everything here, though, is talking about sticks, right? So, for example, if you go to Markulis, now the way that you serve Markulis is you throw a stone at it. If you take a stick and you break the stick in half, even though it's zvicha with a stick, but sticks aren't relevant to Markulis, okay? So therefore, meaning within the Avodah Zarah that you worship with a stick, so if you do something with that stick that's like they do in the Beis HaMikdash, so then you'll be chayiv for that. But if you go up to Markulis, which the medium for Markulis is stones, and you break a stick, you'll be potter for that. But because we're talking about something that is worshipped with a stick, and you did something with the stick that, while not the official way to worship that Avodah Zarah, it is something that is similar to how they do it in the Beis HaMikdash, you are chayiv for that. You are chayiv for that. Maybe now I'll make that one more distinction, even though there's a lot of information right now, I'm going to throw it in there, one more little distinction, and then we'll kind of have all the pieces that we need for the next while. And that other distinction is there's ke'ein zvicha and there's ke'ein pnim. The question is, how similar do you need it to be to like what they did in the Beis HaMikdash, right? So we already saw, right, well, when it comes to zrika, it would have to break apart in order to be considered zrika. But we can go a step further and say, well, does it have to be blood, for example? Like, how similar does it have to be, right? Breaking a stick in half, it's ke'ein zvicha. It's like you're slaughtering a stick, but we don't slaughter sticks in the Beis HaMikdash. We slaughter animals. So if you say mamish needs to be ke'ein pnim, right? So we can see a distinction between ke'ein zvicha. Does it have to be like slaughtering? And sure, breaking a stick in half is like slaughtering a stick, sure. But if a mamish needs to be ke'ein pnim, you can't slaughter. It wouldn't be enough to slaughter a stick. You'd have to actually slaughter an animal. Okay, so the question is how far do we go with that? But for now, we're not yet there on like the animals. We're just focusing on the ke'ein zvicha, ke'ein zrika, and we're saying for ke'ein zvicha, you would just need to break a stick in half. In terms of ke'ein zrika, you would throw it, but it has to be something that when you throw it, in order to have the basic definition of ke'ein zrika, it would have to be something that breaks apart when you throw it. Sheesh, there's a lot of information here. But it's givaldi. So now, let's read in Nachamo. Amar Rav Yudah Amar Rab, says Rav Yudah Amar Rab, Avodas kechavim, she'avdin oisa b'makel. Oh, so if we're talking about an Avodah Zarah that you worship with a stick. Sticko. So stick is the medium for this Avodah Zarah. Shiber makel b'fonei achayid. So now if instead of tapping the stick, you break the stick, which is like zvicha, so you'll be chayiv for that, because you did something like they do in the Beis HaMikdash. Zarak makel b'fonei potter. If you throw a stick in front of it, so then you're potter. But then Amalei Abai l'Rava, but Abai asked Rava, Ma'ishno shiber dehavale ke'ein zvicha. Why do we say that you're chayiv for breaking the stick? Well, because it's like slaughtering an animal, slaughtering a stick. Well, Zarak nam yahavale ke'ein zrika. Well, then why don't we say the same thing by throwing the stick in front of sticko? Shouldn't that be like when you throw the blood on the mizbeach, for example? So Amalei, so Rava answers, no, it's not. It wouldn't meet the minimum definition of zrika because ba'in and zrika mishtaberes v'leka. We need zrika that would break apart, and this stick isn't going to break apart when you throw it. Blood, you throw blood, right? So we're going to see masechta zvachim coming up pretty soon. Shtei matanu shen arba. What does that mean? You throw the blood on the corner of the mizbech, it splits off to two sides of the mizbech, it breaks apart. So we need zrika that breaks apart. Eisvei, however, Abaye asks a kasha, sofas lot soya, o shenosach l'fonei ovet shemei meraglayim chayiv. Beautiful. If you were to pour excrement or libate before it urine, that's exciting. Chayiv, you'd be chayiv, I guess what, for like nisuch or something? So bishlama, Ovet shomei meraglayim. So I understand why you'd be chayiv for, pouring urine, okay, because it's ika zrika mishtaberes, because that's zrika that would fall apart. Now again, I imagine that we're probably talking about something that in a scenario where you would probably, maybe like talking about pa'or or some scenario where I'd imagine that using urine or excrement would be relevant to the particular Avodah Zarah. And that's what we're saying it's considered nisuch, which is one of those global ones. So I understand by urine, so you pour it and it kind of, breaks apart. But excrement, won't it just be like a clump of excrement? Well, but well, it's talking about moist, that's gross. Excrement that, I guess, breaks apart. Yuck. Okay. Fine. So we defined sort of zrika as needing to be a zrika that falls apart in order for it to be considered zrika that you would be chayiv for. So let's say that this opinion of Rav Yehuda, Marav, that for example, just taking a stick and breaking it in half, and that would be considered zvicha, and therefore you'd be chayiv for that. Let's say it's taka machlekes tanoim. Shachat lachagav. What happens if you slaughter a grasshopper? What happens if you slaughter a grasshopper? Tosfos Taka points out that we must be talking about some kind of Avodah Zarah that you use grasshoppers to serve it, because otherwise, slaughtering grasshopper. I mean, because we're going to talk about later on, slaughtering an animal that has a mum, and we say that is, you potter for slaughtering an animal that has a mum, so certainly slaughtering a grasshopper, which isn't really shaykh to slaughtering, you would be potter for. Right? I mean, if you take an animal that normally you'd be chayiv for slaughtering, but it has a mum, so therefore you're potter, so certainly in grasshopper, which isn't something that you would do inside the Beis HaMikdash, it's not something that is chayiv for shchita b'chlal, certainly you would be potter. So it must be talking about something where actually the medium for serving that Avodah Zarah is with grasshoppers, and you take a grasshopper and you slaughter it. Now, grasshoppers aren't shy, you don't slaughter grasshoppers. So shachad chagav, if you slaughter a grasshopper for Avodah Zarah, Rabbi Yehuda mechayev b'chachamim potim. So Rabbi Yehuda says chayev for slaughtering the grasshoppers, and the chachamim say potter. So my love, let's say the machlokes is the ma'asava aminun kein zvicha, ma'asava lo aminun kein zvicha ele kein pnim, and that's like the distinction that I was mentioning a few minutes ago. That Rav Yehuda Marab, who says by the stick, that if you break the stick in half, it's like zvicha, it's ke'ein zvicha. It's like slaughtering the stick, so to speak. And therefore you're chayiv for that. So this is like Rabbi Yehuda over here, who says that when you take the grasshopper and you slaughter, so to speak, a grasshopper, there's no shechita really by grasshoppers, but you slaughter a grasshopper for this Avodah Zarah that is meant to be worshipped with grasshoppers, but maybe not by slaughtering. I don't know, but you'd maybe throw grasshoppers at it, I don't know. But now you slaughter this grasshopper, Rabbi Yehuda says that you're going to be chayiv, because it's even though it's not technically slaughtering, but it's like slaughtering. Just like breaking a stick is like slaughtering the stick, so slaughtering the grasshopper, it's like you're kind of doing zvicha, and therefore you'll be chayiv for that. And the Rabbanan who say potter, they're going to say, no, that's not enough. Slaughtering a stick would not be enough. Slaughtering a grasshopper is not enough. In order to be chayiv for slaughtering, you have to slaughter an animal. Like a cow or a sheep or something like that in order to be chayiv. Slaughtering a stick doesn't count. Slaughtering a grasshopper doesn't count. So let's say that this opinion of Rav Yehuda Marab about slaughtering the stick, ke'ein zvicha, is actually machlokes tanaim. The Rav Yehuda Marab is like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you're chayiv for slaughtering the grasshopper because it's ke'ein zvicha. But the Chacham disagree. They say you need it to be further. You need it to actually be like a real animal, not a grasshopper, not a stick. To which the Gemara answers, no. No, you could say that both in that brisa, both Rabbi Yehuda and the Chacham agree that it needs to be ke'ein pnim. It would need to be like they do inside, like a proper animal. Right? Breaking a stick would not be enough. Okay, where am I? However, even though you need it to be ke'ein pnim, it would have to be like an actual animal that they would serve, that they would worship in that they would offer in the Beis HaMikdash. Rabbi Yehuda makes an exception here when it comes to a grasshopper, because a grasshopper has apparently a neck that is similar to an animal, and therefore, even though a grasshopper isn't one of these animals, in this case, and as Tosfos points out, we're talking about an Avodah Zarah that anyways is worshipped with grasshoppers, maybe not by slaughtering it, but it's worshipped with grasshoppers, and then you slaughter this grasshopper for this Avodah Zarah, even though it's not a proper animal. However, Rabbi Yehuda would say, in this case, because grasshoppers have a neck that's similar to an animal, we could consider it ke'ein pnim, and you'd be chayiv for that. However, the Gemara says, you could say that nobody in this brisa, neither Rabbi Yehuda nor the Chacham, would agree with Rabbi Yehuda Marav, who says you could break a stick and call that ke'ein zvicha and say that you're chayiv for that. They wouldn't necessarily agree with that. Omar Rav Nachman and Rabbi Baravu, Omar Rav. Avodas Chacham Shorif den Oseh b'makol. Okay, back to sticko. And if a desire that is worshipped with a stick, Shiber makol b'funei chayiv. So if you break a stick in front of it, you're chayiv, right? Like we said, because it's like zvicha. And interestingly, v'ne'eseres. Okay, now we're going one step deeper. Not only are you chayiv for breaking that stick, because it's like zvicha, it's like you're slaughtering the stick, But not only that, because it's an offering to sticko, you're offering the stick, you're breaking it in half, you're sacrificing the stick. So it's an offering to sticko, and offerings, of course, are also forever. So again, Rav Nachman and Rabbi Baruch Amarav Avodas Chom She'od Denoisav Makol Shiber Makol B'Fonei Achai B'Ne'aseres. Not only Achai, but the stick itself is also forever because it's an offering to Avodah Zarah. Zorak Makol L'Fonei. Now, if you throw a stick in front of it, and Rashi points out that the assumption in this brisa is that the way that you worship sticko is not by tapping the stick, but rather by throwing the stick, as we're saying right now. So Zorak Makol Fonel. Now, if you throw the stick to sticko, which is the way to worship it, Chayav, so you're going to be Chayav for worshiping sticko. However, the stick itself that you threw at it won't be considered an offering that you would be chayav, that would be asur forever, because in order for it to be considered an offering that is asur forever, it would have to be similar to one of the things that we do in the Beis HaMikdash, whether it's slaughtering, whether it's throwing, etc. And here, as we've seen, throwing needs to be breakable, and here when you throw the stick, it's not breakable. So while you'd be chayav for serving, for worshiping sticko, because you're supposed to throw a stick at it, you did throw a stick at it, so you can be chayav for that, but the stick itself won't be also forever, because the stick itself won't be considered an offering, a tikroves, an offering that would be chayav forever, because that would have to be something that is like done in the Beis HaMikdash. And the most similar thing that this would be too would be throwing, but throwing needs to be breakable and the stick doesn't break. So again, so Zorak Makol L'Foneh, if you throw the stick in front of it, so you serve it in the way that it's meant to be served, Chayev, so you'll be Chayev for serving the Avodah Zarah. However, Ve'ena Ne'eseres, but the stick itself will not be considered an offering that would be also forever. Rav Nachman. So now Rava asked Rav Nachman like Abaye had asked Rava earlier, which is kind of why I wondered if Abaye asked Rava or maybe asked Rabba, but I didn't see anybody who changed it. But anyways, why do we say that the stick that you break for sticko, that you slaughter, so to speak, for sticko, we say the stick itself is osur because it's ke'ein zvicha. You're slaughtering it like they slaughter in the Beis HaMikdash. Zarak nami avile ke'ein zvika. So why don't we say the same thing by throwing the stick to sticko? Shouldn't that be like zrika? Amarle, Rav Nachman responds, ba'ina zrika, mishtaberes veleka. Well, in order for it to be considered zrika, it has to break, like the blood break, liquids can split. So we need something that splits, and this stick doesn't split, and therefore it's not zrika, and therefore it's not considered a tikrovis avodah zarah that would be also forever. And while you're chayev for worshipping sticko, the stick itself is not also forever. Okay. It's not considered an offering that would be also forever. Elameata. But now, Rava asks Rav Nachman, Avne beis markulis bame ye osru. So now Rava asks a question as pertains to markulis. Markulis is be'etzim a pile of stones, and you add to the pile. You throw stones at markulis grows. So the shaila is, how would those stones themselves be usr? Because if we're saying that in order for zrika to be zrika, it would have to break. These stones don't break. So while the thrower would be chayav for worshipping markulis, for throwing a stone at markulis, but these stones themselves would be permitted because it's not considered offerings. It's not zrika. They don't break. So Rava says, so how do they become asur then? El miata, I'm reading again. Abne beis markulis, bamne asur. How do they become asur? Omar le, Rav Nachman responds, af ledidi kashali. Rav Nachman responds that I had the same question. Vishaltia, V'shalte l'Rabbi bar Avua. So I asked the kasha to my Rabbi, to Rabbi bar Avua, Rabbi bar Avua l'chia bar Rav, l'chia bar Rav l'Rav. It went all the way up to the great Rav. V'amar lei, and Rav said maybe to Chia bar Rav, his son, to Chia bar Rav maybe. V'amar lei naisa ki migadol avodas kuchav. Well, says Rav, that when you throw a stone at Markulis, well, it gets added to, as we called it yesterday, the main Markulis. So as you throw stones at Markulis, the stone is added to the Markulis, and it becomes part of the Markulis, and it's therefore now also for being in Avodah Zarah itself, not an offering of Avodah Zarah, but the actual Avodah Zarah. The nafkamina, though, is that it could become batal, right? An offering, we're saying, can never become batal. Avodah Zarah, it could be mevatel Avodah Zarah. But anyways, in the meantime, so long as the main Markulis is main Markulising, this rock is now part of the main Markulis, and it's also for being Avodah Zarah itself. So we're going to see taka, depending on how far we get today. I'd like to get to this Mishnah later on, but I have a feeling it's going to be a long daf, but I'd like to get to this Mishnah. So according to the opinion, it says that the Avodah Zarah of an Oved Chacham becomes asur immediately. So then immediately upon throwing the rock at Markulis and adding the rock to the pile of Markulis stones, so immediately it becomes part of Markulis, becomes Avodah Zarah, and it's asur. Or Tishtri, Dalupalcha. However, it's a machlekes. Machlekes says we're going to see Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva. We'll probably get to that probably tomorrow with machlekes. But it's a machlekes. There's another opinion that says that Avodah Zarah of an Oved Kachavim is only asur once it's worshipped. In which case, throwing the stone at Markulis and adding it to the pile of stones of Markulis does not immediately make it asur. Only when it's worshipped does it become asur. So in that case, how did these stones become asur? So Amar Lei, so Rav Nachman responds to Rave, Kol achas v'achas nachas avodas naisus avodas kol chavim v'tikrovis lachaverto. Look, here's the thing. Lots of people come and throw stones at Markulis. Okay, so you have this pile of Markulis. One guy goes and he throws a stone at Markulis. So by throwing that stone at Markulis, he added to the pile of Markulis, okay. But that stone isn't yet going to be Markulis because it itself wasn't worshipped. But by throwing that stone at the pile of Markulis, he worshipped the Markulis. And the Markulis, what was there? All the stones that had been thrown there before it. So by this person throwing his stone at Markulis, he's worshipping Markulis. And also all of the existing stones are being worshipped as well, which means that when the next person throws a stone at Markulis, at that point, the previous stone was worshipped, right? Because when the next person throws his stone at Markulis, he's worshipping all of the existing stones of Markulis, which now includes the previous thrower's stone. So basically, every time you throw a stone, you're worshipping Markulis and also worshipping all of the, right, you yourself are worshipping Markulis, and all of the existing stones are getting worshipped. And at that point, all existing stones become included and part of the Avodah Zarah that is over there, the Markulis itself. Tishtri, to which Rava presses and he says, okay, but the most recent stone is always going to be permitted because that one hasn't yet been worshipped, right? The last person to throw his stone and adds that stone to the pile, that particular stone is not yet asur until the next person throws a stone at it and worships the entire pile, including that recent stone. But the last stone, the most recent stone, is always going to be permitted because it hasn't yet been worshipped yet. Amalei, to which Rav Nachman responds, sure. Look, there's a huge pile of who knows how many stones. Possibly many, many stones. If you know which of those stones is the most recent one, sure, go and take it and pick it out. It's not yet us, so you're right. But how are you going to know? I mean, there's a whole pile of stones. How are you going to know which one is the most recent stone to go and pluck it out? And therefore, effectively, while technically you're right, yeah, the most recent one is mutter, but I mean, good luck figuring out which one that is. They all look the same, So therefore, for all practical purposes, they're all going to be also. Rav Ashi Omar says, Rav Ashi kol achas v'achas naises tikroves le'atzma v'tikroves lachaverta. So Rav Ashi actually suggests that actually by throwing the stone, you are both worshipping existing stones, but also itself. Kilu toch kedei, that you throw the stone, it's being added to the pile, but also being as part of the pile. Now it's also being worshipped, and therefore every subsequent stone, as each stone is added, argues Rav Ashi, it itself is also being worshipped immediately at the same time, and therefore it immediately becomes also. What does Rashi say? Tikrovas la'atzma shari ein la'avoda acheres ela zriko v'zukos enases avodas kochom v'ne'evedes v'afilu achron enases mishum avodas kochom atzma. Yep. So Rashi says that each subsequent stone, as it's being thrown, is both being added to the pile as well as being worshipped as part of the pile, and therefore Rav Ashi's opinion is that even the most recent stone will itself be osur as Avodah Zarah. Not necessarily as a tikrovis Avodah Zarah, but as the Avodah Zarah pile itself. Tonight, we learn in a Mishnah that we're going to get to on today's daf, on Nun Aleph Amud Beis. Matzaburosho ksus umos okel. If one finds on top of the markulis clothing, money, vessels, hare elu mutar. These items are mutter. These items are mutter. They are not osir. Parchile anovim, clusters of grapes, ve'atarus shel shibolim, or wreaths, I think, of grain, ve'yenis, wine, shmanim, oil, v'slosis, flowers, meaning like flour that you make bread with, v'chol davar shekayotze bo, karev l'gav mizbeach, and anything that is offered on the mizbeach, osir, those things would be osir. Bishlama yenos shmanim v'slasos. Okay, I understand wine, oils, flour. Ika kein pnim, v'ika kein zrika mishtaberes. These are things that are offered in the Beis HaMikdash. Oils, flour, wine, and also zrika mishtaberes. When you throw them, they break apart. But when it comes to clusters of grapes, when it comes to wreaths of grain, we don't offer clusters of grapes and wreaths of grain in the Beis HaMikdash. We offer flour, we offer wine, but not clusters. And also when you throw them, they don't break apart. They're solids. Okay, loke pnimika, v'loke zrika, mishtaberesika. So Marava Amar Ula kigon shabatzu mitchilachach. Well, don't focus on the zrika, focus on the zvicha. That when they were harvested, milichatchila, when you broke off the clusters of the grapes, so that was like zvicha. That was right. That was kilu, you were slaughtering, so to speak, the vine for Avodah Zarah. Okay, fine. So it says Rashi is like breaking a stick, and therefore it's like zvicha. Okay. Okay. Now, normally, and as we're going to see later on today's daf, right? Right, we're going to get there 4 lines from the bottom of today's daf. Right, normally, slaughtering an animal for any Avodah Zarah, right? That's like a global Avodah Zarah, right? We talked about breaking a stick. Breaking a stick is only considered Kain's Vicha when we're talking about Avodah Zarah. They actually worship with a stick. But slaughtering an animal for Avodah Zarah, now that is a global. That's a global one. Right? As the Gemara is going to say later on, as I just read, that slaughtering an animal for Markulis, you're chayiv for that. Slaughtering an animal is a global Avodah Zarah thing that you're going to be chayiv for. But what if the animal has a mum? So says the Gemara, how do we know that if somebody slaughters an animal for Avodah Zarah, but it has a mum, a blemish, so you're potter for that? Shneimar, as opposed to says, Zoveach leloim yochoram, anybody who slaughters, who sacrifices for Avodah Zarah is in big trouble. Beutify Hashem levado, only for God. Sacrifices are only for God. Lo aser Torah ela ke'ein pnim, that we compare the beutify Hashem levado to the Zoveach leloim yochoram, which is Lo aser Torah, I'm reading again, ela ke'ein pnim. That when we say that it's forbidden to sacrifice for Avodah Zarah, it has to be a sacrifice that is similar to how we sacrifice in the Beis HaMikdash, without blemishes. If there's a blemish, you potter. Havi bar Rava. Now Rava wants to know what kind of blemishes are we talking about, because there are levels of blemishes, right? I am recording this on Friday. Tisha B'Av is on Sunday. There's of course the Gemara masechta Gin, Kamsa and Bar Kamsa. That was a tragic story, and part of that story was that Kamsa, the Bar Kamsa, suggested that an animal be brought that had a specific kind of mum, bedok sheba'ayin, had a cataract, which for us is a problem, for them it's not a problem. So this is punct to what we're talking about. So Avi Bar Rava b'mai, what kind of mum are we talking about? Is you'd be potter if you slaughter that animal for Avodah Zarah. Ilema bedok sheba'ayin, if we're talking about it as a cataract. Well, if that's the case, hashta livnei noyach chazi legavoya b'bama dedu. A ben noyach is allowed to offer, right? If a ben noyach wants to make a bama, a makeshift, right, his own altar in his backyard and slaughter an animal for Hashem, he can do it. What if the animal has a cataract? That's okay. For them, it's okay. So if for Hashem it's okay, certainly for Avodas Kocham, you'd be chayiv for that. It would be considered a sacrifice for Avodah Zarah. If it suffices to be offered to Hashem, certainly it would be considered something that would be chayiv for if you slaughter it for Avodas Kocham. Ella b'mechusar aver, the kind of mum that we're talking about that you'd be potter for by Avodah Zarah if it's missing a limb. And like Rabbi Lazar, that we saw this earlier. Where do we see this? We saw this on Daf Hey. Sheesh, that was a long time ago already. A month and a half ago. Wow, we've been learning Avodah Zarah for a long time. How do I know that an animal that is missing a limb may not be offered by Bnei Noach as a korban? Shenemar, as the pasuk says, umikol achai mikol boser shnai mikol. That by Noach brought animals on the teva, on the ark, with him. Now, of course, from the kosher animals, he was ultimately going to offer korbanos from them, sacrifice them, and Noach was a ben Noach. And we said there that it says mikol achai mikol boser shnai mikol Amr Torah, Havi Beima Shechayin Roshe Evarin Shela. What we're saying, Mikol Achai, means Shechai Roshe Evarin Shela, it has all of its limbs. So we see that these animals that Noach brought with him on the ark, from which he was ultimately going to offer sacrifices, they had to have all of their limbs. They could not be missing a limb. So there you have it. That mechusar aver for a korban, for a ben Noach to Hashem, mechusar aver is aser. It has to have all of its limbs. Meaning it has to have all of its limbs, and therefore you wouldn't offer without its limbs, and if you offer to Avodah Zarah without a limb, you'd be potter for that. Hi, mikol achai mi boile the mutet shefa. But one second, mikol achai is not coming to exclude missing limbs. It's coming to exclude treifas. that you can't offer a treifa, but we don't know anything about missing limbs. No, treifa is excluded for korbanos avodah kochavim from lahachio zera, that Noach brought animals that would be able to have babies, and treifas can't have babies, so they are excluded from there. No, I skipped. Well, that makes sense if you hold, in fact, that treifas don't have babies. So sure, lahachio zera would exclude treifas because they don't have babies. However, but according to the Manda Omer, who says that treifas can have babies, so lahachio zera, they fit into that classification. Treifas can have babies. So the Manda Omer yoledes, treifa yoledes, ma'ikel meimer. So then, from where do we exclude treifas? So Omar Kro, well, the pasuk says itoch bedomenloch. Well, the pasuk says to live with you, like you. And just like you, Noach, are healthy, not a treifa, so also all of the animals that you're going to bring with you must be healthy. They can't be treifas. And therefore, again, Mikol Achai is therefore available to teach us that it has to have all of its limbs. And treifas are excluded from itoch. But v'dilma Noach gufei treifa ava. But wait a second, maybe Noach himself was a treifa. Maybe Noach himself was not healthy. Maybe he was a treifa. And Noach brought treifas onto the boat. Well, Tomim Ksid. The Pasuk says by Noach. Noach ish tzadik Tomim. Tomim means whole, healthy, complete, not a treifa. V'dilma Tomim D'rochov. Maybe it just means that he was a good, wholesome person. A good person, but a not healthy person. Tzadik Siv. No, it says tzadik. I think the point is that means he was a good person. Tomim means he was healthy. Tzadik Siv Bey. Dilma Tomim B'dochav v'tzadik b'maisu. Well, maybe it means that he was wholesome in his ways and he was righteous in his actions. They are both Tomim and Tzadik are expressing Noach's character, not his health. But maybe he was taka a treifa though. Lo matzis all might Noach gufei treifa ava. No, people. Noach, let me be clear, Noach was not a treifa. Because if it enters your mind that Noach was unhealthy, that's insane. That he was a treifa. That makes no sense. The Rabban Shalom is destroying the world with a flood. All of humanity's future is hinged on this one treifa person, Noach, and not only that, we say, itoch bedomenloch, fill up your boat, you fill up your ark with a bunch of treifas. Makes no sense. Therefore, Noach was healthy, and all of the animals were healthy. They were not treifas. And therefore, Noach was healthy, all the animals were healthy. Mikol Achai is saying that they have to have all of their limbs. Okay, gewaldig. And we also learned from there, okay, they had to have all their limbs, and if they're missing a limb, they'll be potter, but you don't offer it as an Ovikam wouldn't offer it on their bama, and also you'd be potter for offering it to Avodah Zarah. Okay. Now, question, we had mentioned earlier the words lahachio zera. Why do we need lahachio zera? We thought maybe it was to exclude treifas, but we already talked about treifas. They're like, Noach was healthy, they're healthy, so what do you learn from lahachio zera? Now that treifas are excluded from itoch, so then why do I need lachios zera? Well, to teach me that he had to bring onto the ark animals that were capable of having babies, not just healthy, not just with all limbs, but also able to have babies. If simply from itoch, just bring healthy animals with you so that you have people, well, not people, you have animals to hang out with. Even an old animal, even a castrato animal that can't have babies. No. Bring animals that would be able to have babies. Okay. But we learned from there that animals that are missing limbs would not be offered by Bnei Noach on their bamas, and also if they were offered to Avodah Zarah, you would be potter for offering that animal. Rabbi Elazar, says Rabbi Elazar, how do you know that slaughtering an animal for Markulis? Markulis, you're supposed to throw rocks at it. This guy brings an animal, slaughters the animal for Markulis. How do you know you're chayiv for that? Don't slaughter animals for Avodah Zarah. That's what the pasuk says. So there you have it. Where's that pasuk from? Is it from this week's parsha? Maybe next week's parsha. Or the week after that. That we have a pasuk that says Eicha Yavdu Agoyim O'eles Elohim. What does the pasuk say? What pasuk is this? Pasuk Vav. I'm reading the pasuk. Pen tinokesh achrei machrei shamdo miponecho fen tidrosh Elohim lemo Eicha Yavdu Agoyim O'eles Elohim ve'ese kein gam oni. We already have a pasuk that says, don't say, let me see how the Ovdei Kochavim worship their Avodah Zarah, and I will do it the same way. So we already have a pasuk that says that however Avodah Zarah is meant to be worshipped, you'll be chayiv for worshiping it that way. Therefore, if you're supposed to throw a rock at Markulis, you'll be chayiv for throwing a rock at it. If the way to worship an Avodah Zarah is by slaughtering an animal for Avodah Zarah, that's the way that Avodah Zarah is worshipped. You slaughter an animal, so of course you'll be chayiv for slaughtering an animal for that Avodah Zarah, just like you're chayiv for throwing a rock at Markulis. So what's the pasuk of v'lo yizbechu od as zivcheim la'seirim? So it's not talking about an Avodah Zarah where you're supposed to slaughter it. We already know that. Just like you're chayiv for throwing a stone at Markulis, you're chayiv for throwing for slaughtering an animal for Avodah Zarah. You're supposed to slaughter an animal from. It's just simply the way it's supposed to be done. So you're chayiv for that. So this pasuk of v'lo yizbechu od as zivcheim la'seirim is coming to say that actually it's a global thing. I don't care how. So you go to Markulis and you're supposed to throw a stone, but you slaughter an animal, you're going to be chayiv because of the pasuk that says v'lo yizbechu od as zivcheim. It's not talking about where it's supposed to be offered that way. We already know that. It's talking about even when it's not the way to worship that particular Avodah Zarah, still you'll be chayiv for slaughtering an animal for that Avodah Zarah. It's a global Avodah. So Tanei Inan L'Shalo Kedarka say that it's talking about when you slaughter an animal, even though it's not the proper way for that particular Avodah Zarah, you still be chayiv for slaughtering an animal for Avodah Zarah. But frag de Gemara ve'ha lehachi u de also. But one second. Is this pasuk really for this purpose? Is v'lo yizbechu od coming to teach that you're always chayiv for slaughtering for Avodah Zarah? I thought it was needed. The context of this pasuk of v'lo yizbechu od as zivcheim is the context of shchutei chutz. Of when you slaughter and offer a sacrifice outside of the Beis HaMikdash. You're chayiv kares for doing that. And this pasuk of v'lo yizbechu od as zivcheim is in that context of shchutei chutz. Slaughtering an animal outside of the Beis HaMikdash or outside of the Mishkan. Arkanu midaber b'kodim shekdishon b'shas isur abamis v'krivim b'shas isur abamis. So we say that until the pasuk of v'lo yizbechu od in the context of shchutei chutz, we're talking about that you're chayav b'kodim shekdishon b'shas isur abamis, with kodshim that you were makdish the kodshim when right outside of the Beis HaMikdash b'shas isur abamis. Who could tell me what shas isur abamis is? Abama was just a makeshift altar that you could make in your backyard, slaughter a sheep, put it on the altar for Hashem, amazing. There were times when that was allowed, and there are times when it's not. Now it's shas isur abamis. Right now, 2025, you can't just make a altar and offer a korban. That is not allowed. There were times, however, when it was allowed. Even when there was the Mishkan. When there was Mishkan Shiloh, I believe it was shas isur abamis, but there were other times when the Mishkan was being put up and taken down, whatever. There were periods when there was a shas heter abamis that you were allowed to just make your own altar and offer a korban there. So now that, of course, was happening outside of the Mishkan, outside of the Beis HaMikdash. It was happening in your backyard. So if you were makdish an animal to offer in your backyard during a time when you were allowed no, so Isher Abamas when you were forbidden from doing so, right? So Kachib Jekdishan, you were makdish the animal, you said, I'm going to bring you as a korban, B'shas Isser Abamas, and you said that at a time when you weren't allowed to be offering korbanos on Bamis. So B'shas Isser Abamas, the Krivan B'shas Isser Abamas, and then you went ahead, and not only did you set aside the animal, but you also offered it in your backyard when you were not allowed to. So then, that's what the pasuk is talking about. That, meaning up until the pasuk of V'leiz B'chu'od, it was talking about being makdish and offering b'shas Isser Habamis. Shari Onshan Amor, their punishment is written there in the pasuk, Shenemar, Vel Pesach Hayal Moed Le'avio V'gomer, that he didn't bring it to the Mishkan, even though he needed to, and therefore his Chayiv Karis, says the pasuk. O Nishamayno Asar Minayin. Okay, and as we know, whenever there's a punishment like Karis, you have to be warned. Tamlomer pen tailo lesecho. There's a pasuk that says, "Pen, lest you offer though your olas," which is that also in the same? No, that's in a different place. Okay. Whenever the pasuk says words like hishamer, guard yourself, pen, lest, al, don't. Enu ela below saise, it's mitzvahs lo saise. Okay. So up until the pasuk of V'leiz B'chu'od, it's talking about when one is makdish and offers a korban b'shas Isser Abamis, mikan ve'elach. But once you get to the pasuk of V'leiz B'chu'od, so hu medaber b'kodshim shekdishan b'shas heter Abamis ve'krivim b'shas Isser Abamis. At that point, now there's a switch, and from the pasuk of V'leiz B'chu'od and on, it's talking about an animal that was makdished, set aside to be a korban when it was allowed to do so, b'shas heter Abamis. But it was then subsequently offered when bamis were no longer allowed. Right? Let's say he set aside the animal to be a korban, let's say right before Mishkan Shiloh was constructed, but then Mishkan Shiloh was constructed and he could no longer offer it in his backyard. And if he does, so that's what we're talking about in the pasuk. B'shas Isser Abamis shenemar, the pasuk says, "L'man asher yaviu b'nei Yisrael zivchayim," so that the Yidden will bring their offerings, asher im zovchim, that they're offering sheitarti l'cha kvar, that which I had already permitted to you, right? He had set it aside at the time that it was heter abamis. He was allowed to set it aside. Al pnei asad melam shkol zovech b'bama b'shas Isser Abamis ma'lo of a kos of kilu hu zovech al pnei asad. That anybody who offers a offering b'shas Isser Abamis, even if it was set aside b'shas heter abamis, but it was offered b'shas Isser Abamis, then you're going to be in trouble for that. It's going to be like you offered al pnei asada outside of the Beis Hamikdash. When the pasuk says ve'avim la'Hashem, says you have to bring it to Hashem, so mitzvahs essay. That's mitzvahs essay that, in the scenario where you set aside the animal when it was heter abams. So what you have to do is ve'avim la'Hashem, you have to bring it to Hashem. Don't offer in your backyard. You have to bring it to Hashem. That's mitzvahs essay. Umitzvahs l'saisi minayin. Where's the mitzvahs l'saisi? Tamlo v'lo yizb'chu'od ezivchayim. And the pasuk says, "V'lo yizb'chu'od ezivchayim." Don't offer it. So we see it's also a mitzvah lo sais. Yachol ye'onush kars. Is it possible that in this scenario where you set aside where you designated the animal when it was mutter, but offered it when it was usher, would you be chayv karis for that? Tamlam chukas olam tiyeh zos lohem lem v'lo acheres lem. Right? It says this will be for them. What's this? We said it's mitzvah sase and a mitzvah lo sase. That's what it is. Not no chayiv karis. You're violating mitzvah sase, you're violating mitzvah lo sase, but you're not going to be chayiv karis. Okay. No, so what did we just see? We just saw that the pasuk of V'leiz B'chu'od ezivchayim is not teaching us about that if you slaughter a korban for a markul, if you slaughter an animal for markul, it's a chayiv. No. It's talking about whatever the context was there by shchutei chutz. If you are makdish an animal b'shas heter abamis, then offer b'shas Isser Abamis, so you're going to be violating a mitzvah lo saseh V'leiz B'chu'od. It's not talking about slaughtering an animal for markulis. So on my Rava, says Rava, kribe v'lo yizbechu, kribe v'lo od. There's two labs going on in that pasuk. One is v'lo yizbechu, and one is v'lo od. One of them is referring to if you offer an animal that you were makdish b'shas heter abamis, and then you offer it b'shas Isser Abamis outside of the Beis Hamikdash, you're going to be violating a lav. And the other one is to say, don't slaughter an animal for markulis. Both are true. And now we get up to our next Mishnah, which we had actually seen earlier. It says Mishnah, Matzah Barosho Ma'is Kesef. If a person finds at the top of the Markulis Ma'os, money, ksus, clothing, okelim, vessels, harelim mutarin, they are permitted, they're not osir. Parchili anovim, clusters of grapes, ve'atarus shel shibolin, and reeds of grain, ve'yenos, wine, vishmanim, oils, v'slasis, flour, and anything that would be offered on the mizbeach, osir. Says the Gemara, how do we know this? Amar B'chia bar Yosef, Amar B'shai, because of Echad Omer, one pasuk says, Batiru eis shikutzeim, veis giluleim, eitz vo'even, kesef v'zov, asher imoim. So actually, if I want to go back to the Mishnah for 1 second. So Rashi had said on the Mishnah, Mos ksus v'chelim, if you find on the Markulis money, clothing, vessels, says Rashi, she'enan shel noi, because they aren't beautiful. They aren't there to beautify. They aren't there to beautify the Markulis. So now the Gemara says, how do we know this distinction of beautification, of noi? So the answer is, again, Amar B'chia bar Yosef, Amar B'shai, because of Echad Omer, one pasuk says, Batiru shukutzeim, you see their abominations, Vez giluleim, eitz vo'even, kesef v'zov asher imoim. So it says, eitz vo'even, stone, trees, gold, silver, asher imahem. The reason why I'm pointing out as asher imahem, because we're about to see the word alehem. When it says imahem, we're referring to all 4 things, eitz vo'even, kesef v'zov, and now, because of Echad Omer, another pasuk says, lo sachmod kesef v'zov aleim. Don't desire their kesef v'zov upon them. So one pasuk is talking about eitz vo'even kesef v'zov. The other one's just talking about kesef v'zov. Okay, it said, what's the deal with the distinction? Are eitz vo'even included or excluded? So the answer is imayim dumya aleim. The imayim, which is eitz vo'even kesef v'zov, is similar to the aleim, which is kesef v'zov. Ma'aleim davar shanoi osir she'eno shanoi mutter. So just like by aleim, when the pasuk that says kesef v'zov, we're specifically talking about beautiful things. Kesef v'zov. We're not talking about non-beautiful things. So then, af imayim, even the first pasuk, when we're talking about eitz vo'even as well, we're talking about davar shanoi osir v'sheno shanoi mutter. We're specifically saying that what's going to be osir are things that are beautiful. So eitz vo'even could be osir, sure, if it's beautiful. But I'll suggest maybe the opposite. Maybe the kesef v'zov is like the eitz vo'even, i.e., it doesn't have to be beautiful inherently. So where am I? Imayim kol mashe imayim afaleim kol mashe aleim. Okay, so meaning just like the pasuk by eitz vo'even, you could argue is talking about eitz vo'even, however beautiful or not they are. So same thing with kesef v'zov. No, so imkein lo yomer aleim. Well, then you don't really need the pasuk of aleim. If we're just saying eitz vo'even kesef v'zov, whatever state they're in, okay, great. So then why do I need the other pasuk of zov of kesef v'zov? So we need the other pasuk to limit the eitz vo'even kesef v'zov, to say that when we're talking about that, we're talking about beautiful eitz vo'even kesef v'zov. Okay. Ma'os davar shanoyu. The Gemara says, well, money can be something that is a decoration. So amid verbianai bekis kosher v'toli lo b'tzavar. Well, we're talking about where there's like a money pouch that's like hanging on it, not particularly beautifully. Ksus davar shanoyu. Clothing could be beautiful. Amid verbianai beksus mikupeles u'menachas lo arosho. It's talking about a garment that's just kind of folded up and just sitting there. Kli davar shanoyu. A vessel could be beautiful. Amar papa deschifa le mashchilta areshe. It's talking about like a cup or something that's just thrown on it, and also not particularly beautiful. Amar vasi barchia koshu lifnim mina kalkolid. When it comes to Markulis, or I guess even maybe any Avodah Zarah, so there would be some kind of, I guess, divider around it. You would go in the divider and you would worship the Avodah Zarah from there, I guess in some modicum, maybe, if that's a word that's used appropriately, of privacy. Afilu mayim v'melech also. So in that context, within the curtains, even water and salt would be aser. When you're like going within the curtain and you're offering the water and salt, aser. Chutz the kalkolin, but outside of these curtains, davar shalnoi, aser she'eno shalnoi mutu. Well, at that point, it becomes a different sort of characteristics that are important. If it's shalnoi, if it's beautiful, at that point, it'll be aser. If it is not shalnoi, it's mutter. So now, says Reb Yossi Reb Chanina that when it comes specifically to peor and markulis, the role of this divider is irrelevant. Lemai, what's it talking about? If you're going to say that even offerings that happen within the curtain, if there is one by markulis or peor, are permitted, like as if they were outside of the curtain, unless they are for noi. But ashta peori mefarin kame ma'im v'melech lo makriven le. To which we say, I mean, peor, meaning if we're going to say that, even if you offer something within the curtain, you'll be potter. But I mean, peor, you do like some pretty gnarly stuff there. Like the curtain is, you'd be chayav, even for you defecate in front of it. So therefore, if you even defecate in front of it, you're chayav. For offering salt and water, you'd be potter. No, so rather, eller afilu chutz kifnim dami v'aser. No, the opposite. It's like even things that normally would be potter for, when it comes to markulis and peor, you would be chayav for. And even though it's outside of the curtain, you're still going to be chayav by those avodah zaras. And finally, to wrap up today's daf, we get to the final mishnah of today's daf. Avodas kechavim she'haya la gina omerchatz. An avodah zarah that had some kind of a garden or a pool or bathhouse connected to it. I guess right here in Lahabdil, here in Yerushalayim, a few minutes from where I live, there's like a chotzer, a chared by charedim, and in there there's a mikvah, so you go in to use the mikvah. So imagine Lahabdil by avodah zarah, there was a bathhouse there, and you'd go into by the avodah zarah to use the bathhouse. So, and then in Mayan, Shaloi B'Tovim, and then in Mayan Mitos. There was a Tosfos about this maybe a week or two ago, because we had B'Tova, Rashi had explained that to B'Tova, whenever that was. Where was this? This was, what's this, hey? This was on Daf Mem Dalet, so about a week ago. So Rashi there had explained B'Tova means giving Akaras Hatov. Here, Rashi means giving money. Tosfos that actually preferred that Akaras Hatov explanation. But anyways, okay, and let's stick with Rashi here. So you can get benefit from the bathhouse, from the garden, shelo b'tova, as long as you're not paying anybody. But if you have to pay anybody, then you can't. If the bathhouse or the garden was jointly owned by the Avodah Zarah and by others, nen and main, bein b'tova v'shelo b'tova, you can benefit from the bathhouse or the garden, whether you pay, whether you don't pay, either way, it's permitted. Okay. Avodah Zarah of an Ovid Kuchavin is also immediately, but for a Yid, it has to be worship. Okay, this is going to be actually confusing. This is going to get a little bit confusing actually in the Gemara. It's machlekes between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Shmuel, but anyway, it says our Mishnah that the Avodah Zarah of an Ovid Kuchavin is also immediately, but by a Yid, it has to be worshipped. Okay, so if you build an Avodah Zarah, if it's an Ovid Kuchavin, if it's the Avodah Zarah of an Ovid Kuchavin, it's immediately Aser. If it's the Avodah Zarah of a Yid, it is not yet Aser until it's actually worshipped. Only at that point does it become Aser. Okay, fine. Says the Gemara, Amar Abai, says Abai, that when we're talking about that you can get benefit from the bathhouse, Shelo b'tova, but not pay anybody. B'tovas komrin. So b'tovas komrin, shelo b'tovas komrin. La'afuke tovas ovdei deshari. Says Abai that when we're talking about paying, we're talking about paying the priests, the galach, the priest. As long as you don't pay the priest, it's okay. If you pay the priest, not okay. You could pay somebody else, right? If you, right? There's other people working there and you pay them, that's fine, but don't pay the priest. Those who actually teach it about the seifa, about when the Bautas is jointly owned by the Avodah Zarah and others. If the Bautas is jointly owned, then in Mein B'tova, you can get benefit from, right? If Mein B'tova v'shelo b'tova, whether you're paying or not. Amar Abai says, Abai B'tovas acherim, you could pay others, shelo b'tovas komin. And as long as you're not benefiting the priests. Man demasni ha-sefer, the one who says, talking about the sefer, kol shekain aresha. Certainly, when it comes to the ratio would not be allowed, right? So if we're saying that even in the sefer, when it's jointly owned, you cannot benefit the priests, well, certainly in the ratio where it's only owned by the Avodah Zarah, you cannot benefit the priests. But the one who says that on the ratio you can't benefit the priests, but if you could say that, or you could argue that by when it's jointly owned, then you can even pay the priests because it's not entirely their benefit. It's jointly owned, so that could be okay. That was the Nun Aleph of masechta Avodah Zarah. Wow, that was a packed daf. That must have been a long daf. I don't even know how long that was, but we've had some long dafs recently. Anyways. So we talked about offering Avodah Zarah, very interesting stuff. We talked about, later on in the daf, we talked about sacrificing animals. I feel like maybe we'll work backwards. Sacrificing animals to Avodah Zarah is always going to be asur. Sacrificing an animal to Avodah Zarah is always going to be asur. Now, if that animal has a mum, you'll be potter. Now, when it comes to other kinds of offerings, for example, breaking a stick or throwing stuff out of Avodah Zarah, so then relative to what the Avodah Zarah is, if it's Avodah Zarah they worship with sticks, well then breaking a stick could be like zvicha. Throwing a stick could be like zrika, except that we're saying because it doesn't break apart, it's actually not like zrika. We had that whole discussion. And then we kind of moved on to decorations of Avodah Zarah. Decorations of Avodah Zarah are asur. And then we got into using bathhouses and gardens of Avodah Zarah. And then we got, as part of the last Mishnah, we had mentioned that the Avodah Zarah of an Oved Kochavim is immediately asur, but for a Yid, he has to worship it to be, for it to be asur. That is what we're going to discuss tomorrow for a chunk of the daf. We'll see, it's actually Machlekes Rabbi Shimon Rabbi Akiva. Chaver, I hope you enjoyed Daf Nun Aleph, masechta Avodah Zarah. I hope you enjoyed. Peace out.